Hello and welcome to another edition of ScoreTalk, our weekly webinars where we host discussions with communications leaders on contemporary issues. My name is Hemant Gole and I'm a part of School of Communications and Reputation. This is our fifth consecutive edition and the first where we are hosting leaders of PR from various geographies. Our panelists are joining us all the way from United States to South Korea. I want to thank Reputation today for helping us make this series possible. And I also want to thank OneSource and MXM India for helping us reach out to the communications fraternity. The hashtag for this event is hashtag ScoreTalk. So if you find anything insightful, please tweet about it or post it on any social media with that hashtag. We'd like to see one of the most powerful takeaways from this session as your tweets and social media posts. If you're watching this on Zoom and if you have any questions, feel free to put this in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This is also being live streamed on our YouTube channel in case you want to share that link with anybody. We have an incredible panel today and the conversation is being moderated by Tuhina Pandey, communications leader for IBM India and South Asia. Thank you so much for moderating this session, Tuhina, and over to you.
Thank you, Hemant, for that introduction, and a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us today for this very insightful session. And the big question at hand truly is, how do brands transition and prepare for a world beyond the lockdown? Also, I think the big question is, what's the playbook going to look like for brands as they prepare and transition to a post-COVID world? And who better to answer those questions but those who are the custodian of brands, who are on the front rows navigating through this crisis, shaping the way this industry is going to be. And of course, like I said, it's going to be an accomplished panel that we are going to be in conversation with. With that, may I invite and warmly, in fact, welcome my panel, Douglas Du. He is the Corporate and Public Affairs Head, Asia Pacific for BCW. Joining us is also Esti Puadas. She's actually joining us from New York, and she is the president and partner for Asia Pacific, Middle East and Africa, as well as LATAM regions for Ketchum. Also delighted to have Margaret Key on the panel. She's the CEO for MSL for Asia Pacific, Middle East and Africa as well. Also joining us is Tarun Deo. He is from Golan, and he's the managing director for Singapore and Southeast Asia. And that's why I said it's an accomplished panel. They get in a diverse view from diverse places and geographies, and that's going to be an insightful set. Let me draw in Doug, first question to you. You know, everything has changed in the last few months. The stadiums have turned into hospitals. You have manufacturers coming and manufacturing sanitizers and ventilators. You have governments give directives about work from home and stay at home policies. How has it particularly touched your life, and what has changed from your perspective? If you can really talk to us through that.
Well, I think for me, part of my personal experience was being in isolation for quite a long time on my own. So when I got back to China just in time to get in before they closed the borders to foreigners returning, I spent 2 weeks in a government quarantine, designated quarantine hotel, locked in a room while I completed the quarantine. And then after that, I went home to my apartment in Beijing, where I spent 6 weeks by myself before being rejoined by family. So it wasn't really a hardship for me, I mean, especially compared to lots of the experiences that others have had of COVID-19. But it definitely highlighted to me the potential for breaking the status quo and breaking habits out of necessity, just in my personal life. And I think you can extend that to many aspects of your professional life as well. Obviously, for all of us, we've been kind of catapulted forward into a digital existence with Teams and with other forms of digital communications and collaboration tools and that kind of thing. And I was experiencing that digital life in my personal life as well as my professional life. And that's how I got through those 6 weeks of isolation. I did things that I just haven't done for a long time because I had to, like cooking. I cooked more in a month than I have in 10 years. And I had the opportunity to read all sorts of things because I had so much time on my hands. There's so many silver linings and positives out of this, what is, I know, a very tough experience for many people. But,
yes, it is about breaking the status quo. And if I can bring in ST here. ST, I've heard you talk about, the whole shift in consumer behavior. And, as Doug was talking about, the personal habits and habits have changed. So have the consumers and how they're interacting with the brand, how they connect with the brand. And therefore, the onus is on brands to appeal to them and connect to them differently. What's your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. There is so much going on, and I think we need to keep in mind the most important thing for brands right now is to really think about how their audiences may have changed during the pandemic. What is really coming to them. And there's a couple of common themes, that we're seeing. I think that audiences are headed to a higher ground, which is that they're resetting their priorities and greater appreciation for macro issues like the environment and togetherness. As we all have experienced during this, we're virtual, but we're getting even more closer because we have the need to communicate with each other, constantly as we're isolated. The other one is the appreciation for frontline workers, those heroes of the pandemic. Everybody has such gratitude, for everybody that has been out there, whether it's a healthcare worker or it's the person that you're buying groceries from, because those are the people that you're connecting with right now. It's very hyper local, if you will. And the third one is, something that is not going to be a surprise to anybody, but is the persistence in price sensitivity. And value has become paramount to our decision making, but how we interpret value is very different, for everybody. And I think for brands, successful brands, it will be about connecting with this evolving mindset and join the chorus of appreciation of those heroes and prove and reprove their value, throughout this journey that we've all kind of come together with through the pandemic.
Right, I hear you. So what you're saying is that we got to move it a notch up in terms of connecting with the consumers and connect onto the environment and larger purpose than just the brand attribute. Interesting. Margaret, you're on the panel and you are actually in South Korea, which is moving out of the lockdown. So you are in some sense early on or, ahead of the curve. What are your early learnings and how are you observing the landscape evolve?
Yeah, I happen to be, I'm an American by passport, but half Korean. And when the pandemic first hit, my mother, who's living in the States, was calling me incessantly, just checking on me. Are you okay? Are you okay? And now I'm doing the flip. Etsy will realize, having been in the US, where there isn't necessarily kind of the stability in overall management of the pandemic. And I think what I've learned thus far is that as of 3 weeks, we've been back to the office. But it's like I'm walking in a real sci-fi movie. People are having the mask. I actually was on the elevator yesterday, and there was a coworker in the building who I don't know, but basically was kind of criticizing another person in the elevator. Where's your mask? Social distancing is very heavily managed. And so there's kind of this new sense of how we kind of just live together in this world, which is interesting to see. And then from the point of view of communications, because Korea has always been a very digitally savvy country and tech-focused country, everything that I'm seeing from a client perspective is moving digitally very quickly too. So for instance, early on, there was a client of ours who wanted to do an offline event, and we moved it so that it's completely virtual right now. E-commerce platforms are rising for even small and medium-sized businesses where there was a reliance on, just kind of offline engagement. So I actually had one CEO saying that the pandemic has actually just further accelerated digitalization. So it's really interesting, fascinating, I think, for all of us as communicators, once this all does settle, it's going to be interesting to see how the companies will be navigating within the new world. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's something that I deliberate greatly on as well. From a technology standpoint, is this also a golden opportunity for all of us to bridge that digital divide once and for all? And Tarun, as a community, are we experimenting enough? Are we adopting enough of technology? You know, for a long time, we've talked about augmented reality. We've talked about, virtual reality, coming and building those shared experiences. Do you think we are up for the task?
Well, I think it really depends. And if I could just if you just kind of indulge me, I think one of the primary observations I've kind of pulled out, and look, something like COVID-19, just in terms of its impact, how far-reaching it is, how it's affected all of us. It's clearly a seminal event, in our life, right? And just kind of hearing, Doug talk about, the isolation, and we've all gone through this phase where, we've seen various hues of, isolation. Either we've kind of gone through it ourselves, or, we've heard about it from friends or family. And then, of course, you've got this whole thing about, a lockdown, right? And what's kind of struck me in terms of just observing this is that one is, and it kind of comes back to that whole digital divide that you alluded to, is that it's quite fascinating to see how the impact of this seminal element, which is COVID-19, has been so unequal, right? So, obviously, if you look at vulnerable sections of society, and look, let's not get into, whether it's America or, whether it's India or, whether it's Singapore. But if you see the inequality in terms of its impact has been, quite fascinating to see. And I think that's one thing. The other one is, clearly, there's certain industries that have been impacted more than others. So if you look at travel, tourism, hotels, right? And then if you were to look at the business that we are in, which is, communications, right? Yeah, I'm sure, it's affected and it will, impact, what we do. Margaret talked about how, we had events scheduled for clients that, were more kind of physical in nature. And, we've had to kind of move that online. And look, that's largely because, possibly it's happening in a Singapore or a South Korea where, that option is a viable one. But there are so many parts of the world where, they don't have that option. And I think that's the second thing, this whole thing about, industries and, the disparity there. And I'm actually quite proud that, as communication professionals, representing public relations industries, we've been able to really carry on to a certain extent, kind of doing it is what we do. And then I think finally, clearly there's, certain businesses, that, have been, hit harder than others. And, obviously it begs the question, you see some of these, file for bankruptcy cases, especially in the US, right? Big retailers. I mean, one would need to question, did you guys make a sufficient push to go online as an example? Or if you look at the airlines, last year, I think the whole airline industry made 54 billions in net profit, but, a lot of them spent a lot of money buying back their shares. So, there's this whole dichotomy of, how this has effectively played itself out. But this whole inequality thing has been very fascinating.
Absolutely. And let me throw this open, therefore, right? As communicators, as PR professionals, we all heard the individual anecdotes and examples. So things have changed. Let's accept it's never going to be the same again. How is our role going to change? Doug talked about, the blurring lines between government, communication, corporations, and communities at large. What will be the PR firms or PR professionals of tomorrow look like? What is that transition going to be like? Doug, do you want to kind of come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think our role as communication counsellors and public affairs counsellors only more important now, helping clients understand these macro trends that are reshaping the world, and that many of which have been accelerated or impacted by COVID-19. So helping clients understand these geopolitical dimensions, helping clients understand the impacts of nationalism or populism, and the rejection of globalization, and all the kind of interdependencies and triggering between those kinds of trends, and being able to advise clients as they navigate all of that. And being here in APAC, a key part of that is navigating Asia's rise. And people ask, has the shift of power from west to east been impacted by COVID-19? Some would argue it's been accelerated. And so for many of us over the next 10 years, the key story is going to be navigating Asia's rise and the geopolitical and other consequences and opportunities of that. So I think, one change is that it's even more important that we are able to occupy that space and go on that journey with our clients.
Yes, and the reason why I asked that question more so, because if you look at, let's say, how the media is shaping up, there've been a lot of traditional formats closing down. We have that landscape completely redefined, and we have these digital formats. There are a lot of questions around what happens to earned media, what's the balance going to be with other kinds of media and emerging media types. Margaret, any thoughts on that? Will we mirror how the media is unfolding the landscape?
Well, I'll answer that interestingly from the point of view in Korea, because it's, as a citizen here, I look at this pandemic very much as we would look as a crisis situation, right? It's managing the crisis. And the government in Korea has done such a fantastic job because they're managing this as a crisis. So the communications is very much top down. And trust in the government is at its highest, which is interesting to note. When all is said and done, is where will this trust in government really take us, and how will that also parlay into businesses, right? So for Korea, the level of trust in government is high. And at the same time too, I have never seen the population glued to earn traditional media as they do now. Because at the highest peak of the pandemic, the government was issuing on television as well as online, updates on kind of how the pandemic and the cases and infections were progressing or slowing. So that continues to be the case. So I think that, having said that, there is a level of a trust in the earned media that is interesting to note, when a lot of it was the opposite. But at the same time too, I think nothing has changed really in terms of the impact on traditional media now more than ever in being relevant. So it will be interesting to note our role in all of this moving forward.
Esty, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, of course. I think it's a dichotomy, as everybody's saying. There's a thirst for information, right? During the pandemic, everybody is really searching for that. But at the same time, how do you obtain that information? Our media, is going through their own shifts, their own layoffs and other things. So I think it's going to be very important for them to really reimagine and reinvent themselves and redefine themselves in the way that, companies are looking at how they're engaging with their audiences too. Everybody has to do it with, a way of bringing the information and kind of engaging people, how they want to be engaged with, and, and really in a way that really brings together the information, what I would call positive transparency. People want to know what's going on. People want to understand what's going on out there, but they don't want a deluge of just bad news. They want to know how to get out of this and be informed in a way. And so there's two things, is how you communicate with positive transparency And then the other one is to really continue to accelerate the adoption of communication through digital, because people want it instantaneously, and they want it right there, and they want it consumable, because there's just so much going on around them.
Absolutely. Maybe the answer lies somewhere in between. The hybrid world is perhaps the true world. In fact, it's a good time if we can put the poll up in terms of technology adoption, and we can come back to see what the audience thinks. But Tarun, coming to you. So going back to a step back and asking you, how is a public relations company or a firm going to look like in, let's say, 3 months down the line? Two things that will be new, and maybe a couple of things that will absolutely be a passe.
Well, I think generally, in terms of, what we do, which is, I guess, advise, our clients, right? Irrespective of, what sector they might come from, or, whether they are corporations or, NGOs or, governments. I think there's probably never been a better time to be in the communications business. And, from a Golan perspective, we're really asking ourselves 4 or 5 fundamental questions. How will people live? How will we work? How will we shop? Who can we trust? And I guess this entire conversation that we just had about the performance of the government, traditional media versus social media, I probably put topics like, should we lead with the science? Should we lead with the economy, right? That's all part of that trust bucket. And then somebody just spoke about, who are our new celebrities? I mean, is it, the person who makes mega bucks, or is it, a frontline nurse, or, whatever else, people who are on the front line. So I'm going to put that. So anyway, I think, who do we trust? And then I think fundamentally, what do we value? What's our value proposition, right? And when you kind of put all those things together and kind of view them through the prism of this seminal situation that we're dealing with, I think the possibilities are endless. Now, yes, one might argue, would we ramp up how we get to our audiences digitally? Do we tell more visual stories? Are we still going to gravitate more towards traditional media? And look, that will be a horses for courses strategy. So I think, yes, depending on where you are in the world, where your agency is based, or what your expertise is, what your local environment looks like, you will dial up and dial down certain elements. But I think fundamentally, there has never been a better time to be in communications, really.
Absolutely. In fact, I'll request the team to put that poll up if we can, and then we can come back to what the audience thinks. Yes, it's right up there on your screen. Technology adoption by PR firms will increase significantly in post-COVID world. Yes or no? Please go ahead and give your views. Let me throw this up, okay? Please feel free to come in, anyone on the panel. Let's talk about, we talked about that, look, this is going to change and perhaps the principles are going to remain the same. Is that what I hear you say, that principles of communication is going to remain the same? The form may change a little bit, but never been a better time to be in a communications business. In fact, one of the questions, Gurumukh, I got just now says, how do we build the confidence in the communication community? That's on the downhill. Is that a fair question? Because I hear a lot of my, peer group talk about it as well. How do we push the confidence back into the community of communicators? Because that's going to be a critical, attribute, whether we are going to kind of weather the storm successfully or not.
Yeah, look, I think, believability is a big factor at the moment, right? And I don't think there is a single silver bullet here. And, I'm sure my peers on the panel, would probably have, similar views. I don't believe there is a silver bullet here. I think there's lots of things at play. I think it really starts with, people being informed themselves and aware themselves that, look, not everything that they see, that they hear, is essentially what it says it should be, right?
Sure.
So that would probably be the first thing. And then, obviously, we've had these discussions again as communicators, is word of mouth more effective? Well, yes and no. Traditional media, because a lot of their reporting is based on some foundation and some fact, and, who they quote, etc. Maybe that's more believable. So look, I think there is no real silver bullet here. Is believability an issue today? It certainly is. And I think the onus for all of us as good communicators is to make sure that whatever we're putting out there, is facts first.
Absolutely. Margaret, you want to come in because the community, let's accept it. There is a lack of confidence and people are not sure how this is going to unfold. Those young professionals, for example, have that question on their mind. How do we address that?
I mean, I'm going to kind of piggyback off of what Tarun was saying, that this is our time. I do believe it's kind of like, again, if I use the example of a crisis, and we've all worked with the client who's managed a crisis, and we've all sat in the boardrooms with the C-suite kind of dealing with the crisis. And once everything is done, we go back to our roles. And then, the PR leads kind of go back to the day of just managing what they were doing before the crisis. I think right now, the onus is on us as an industry to really take this forward, because what I'm seeing across all markets and in conversations with our clients is that it is our discipline that has always been kind of the conscious counselor. We are the ones who really know value of a brand. We know how to navigate a conversation around purpose. Even in the holding company structure of where I am, I don't think that my colleagues in advertising will be able to do what we do and what we're going to be able to do in really kind of crafting the role of companies post-COVID, because everyone, you see all the surveys coming out, whether or not you're a millennial or not, the question is, are you watching what companies are doing to give back? The commitment to communities, right? All of this, it's not about the showcase of selling, it is about the showcase of what you're doing, your actions speaking louder than the words. And I do believe that all of us as professionals are probably most gifted and crafted to be able to take that forward.
Right. Esti, how much is too much? Because there is also an overload, right? How much can you talk about something and how much can the brands really communicate? Give us that filter, your understanding of how you read that.
Yeah, I like to reframe that as not so much how much is too much, but, really how you're engaging and to set the right expectations on what to expect from you as a brand. Because, the fundamentals haven't changed here. It's about trust, value, and values. That's what, all these themes, everything that we're seeing, that's what we hear is important. And I think this is an incredible opportunity. And for us at Ketchum and Ketchum Sandpark in India, our primary focus is to really understanding how to engage with audiences. And it's about what this pandemic has shown us is always putting people and their needs first. So brands have an amazing opportunity, and us as communicators and helping them in really showcasing, what they have learned from this and what they're bringing into doing it in a trustworthy way by showing and how they're following, what's happening with their employees, how they were treating their employees through this pandemic. What were they providing? What have they learned? How are they going to bring safety and cleanliness and other things that are becoming huge values to, things that people are valuing right now, and really continuing to show that you have lived as a brand by the values that you have defined yourselves, in. Obviously we've all seen amazing CEOs of many brands around the world and how they communicated at a very difficult time when they had to make some very difficult decisions about reopening, about economic impact and all those things. And those that did it with sensitivity and authenticity and putting people first really won. And you've seen a lot going on right now about scoring, who's done it better, who doesn't. So just to bring it back, it's not so much about the overload, but how you're communicating and making sure that if you're an airline, you're showing, you know, what did you do about cleanliness, you know, during this time, so that there's trust and safety in what you're doing. So I think it's really about communicating, you know, really engaging so that they have trust in you, that your values are seen, and that, you know, and that you appreciate the sensitivity to value right now.
And brings me back to this question, the trust factor, and I've heard everyone talk about it. Doug, one of the critical things as communicators we've always had is relationships. When we met people, when we made that eye contact, when we talked to people in space that was personal, you know, where you could shake hand on something, and that human connect, right? We worked with that. That is not available to us anymore. How do we transcend that same values and trust from a physical to a digital world? What's working for you, for instance, and what can work for the brands?
I think in the absence of being able to meet people face to face, there's obviously lots of technological solutions, and we've all been using them, and we're using them right now. So there are lots of ways that we can have that personal interaction without it being face to face. I think another key aspect of it is making the kind of gathering of insights and the listening process more scientific, so that we're actually going out there and doing the studies and the research that will enable us to get a read on these big publics and stakeholder groups, and not relying on just, you know, some relationships here and there, but having a much more kind of systematic approach to listening and to understanding where stakeholders are on these different topics and different issues. I think another key aspect for us in the agency world is being able to combine capabilities that address different kinds of stakeholder needs and interests. So having that, you know, hardcore government affairs, public affairs capability, combining that with, you know, digital capabilities that are going to enable you to deliver on a kind of modernized public affairs offering, for example, that really goes beyond relationships. You know, in China, we talk about guangxi and relationships as being very important, but actually we transcend that through a much more systematic approach to understanding audiences and utilizing these different combinations of technologies and channels and platforms.
Right. One of the interesting things which has happened, to your point, is a lot of brands coming together, let's say, to research on a vaccine, or the governments coming together to work towards a global charter, and the international bodies becoming so important. So Tarun, obviously co-branding and expanding the scope of a individual brand, there is a classic case for it, is it not?
Yeah, I think, you know, this whole concept about a shared agenda, certainly, you know, the volume on doing that at this point in time is certainly louder than, you know, it's ever been. And, you know, it could be a combination of things. It could be people are just generally humbler, though, of course, you know, I would probably not agree to the point that you made about, for example, governments working together. I mean, are they? Well, you know, I don't really, that's my own personal view. I don't think they are. But coming back to, you know, I guess the shared agenda, you know, look, just this morning, you know, we were doing a call similar like this. You know, it's a global client of ours, and, you know, we've got folks based in Singapore, we've got folks based in LA and in Chicago. And, you know, we were talking about doing a sustainability food program in Mississippi, right? And a big part of our conversation basically centered around two elements. One was who can we work with? And, you know, obviously we had some answers to that. And then I think there was an interesting point here that a lot of the people on that call wanted more. Now, you know, what does more mean? So, you know, we weren't really talking about going to this particular community and just kind of making a donation and leaving. There was a lot of conversations being built around how do we make this longer term? How do we empower this community, which clearly has, in this instance, a nutrition issue? How do we teach them to fish so that once this coalition kind of decides that, look, we need to kind of take this blueprint or template somewhere else, things won't just necessarily fall off the cliff at this particular location. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but you're absolutely right. I think this whole thing about a shared agenda, a coalition, we found that at this point in time, it's something that we've been able to engineer more successfully. And I think a lot of the participants in initiatives like this are, again, for the first time, not thinking about, okay, let's hit that and run. How do we really make an impact? And I think that's really, a heartening, a scenario for me to witness. I've been doing this 25 years, but the generosity in terms of time, and I think the longevity that a lot of these participants are putting into stuff like this is rewarding to see.
Yeah. Understand. I hear you on that. Margaret, what's your view? For example, there are two schools of thoughts in the world today. One is saying we are looking at deglobalization, insulated economies, etc. And then there is another one with saying, hey, listen, this is be a watershed in history where everything goes digital and people come together a lot more. Do you see that sort of cross ventilation from your experience, or do you think we are kind of moving into a more insulated spaces?
I think it's a good question. I mean, what I've seen is, on this notion of coalition is right now, I think beyond digital, everyone's thinking about their home markets. They're thinking about their employees. They're thinking about business in their markets. I thought a great case of how this is all coming to fruition was in China very soon with all the disruption. It's been amazing to watch companies quickly move and pivot from one position to another because of the pandemic. So like industries like we've mentioned before, restaurants and what have you being hard hit, a lot of furloughed staff members or a lot of employees not working. There were industries like, for instance, online grocery delivery in China that just went up very, very significantly. So food deliveries and what have you. And there was an agreement amongst 40 different businesses in China to kind of reallocate employees that weren't working to industries where there was high demand. And that is a great thing to see, because as much as we talk about competition, there is a lot of this focus on partnering where best to do so. And I see that coming very much to life in these local markets. But having said that, I think it's interesting to note, what is this also going to mean from a digital platform in connecting with the other global markets?
Right. And perhaps the point that Tarun made about, different horses for different courses strategy and hybrid may be the real world. So I'm getting a lot of questions as well. So I'm going to, get them through to you guys. ST, one of the questions is interesting from Elizabeth, and she talks about client budgets and allocations. Will it come more to the internal communications, for example? Do you see budgets getting reallocated, increasing, decreasing? What's your sense of the market?
Yeah, I mean, like everything, there's always shifts that happen short term and long term. And I think what we need to keep in mind is that, these things cannot be done in a vacuum. They have to, employees are important, the most important thing right now. I led the COVID management for Ketchum globally, and it was very rewarding for me because it was about putting our people's needs first and making sure that we were communicating, and that would mirror to our clients and how we counsel them and how they engage with employees as well. But I think ultimately where everybody in communications needs to focus is really in understanding the fundamental of your audiences. Because without an audience, without the consumer, and that audience is everybody, right? It's your employee, it's your stakeholders, your shareholders, it's your consumers, it's your customers if you're a B2B company. And I think this moment in time, it's not about hibernating, as a company. It's about marketing and communications continuity and continuing to make sure that you are constantly understanding the mindset that is evolving, from your consumers and your stakeholders and your employees. Your employees are your ambassadors, and to really continue to build programs that are meeting their needs first, the same way that we discussed before, through trust.
Another very interesting question from Saraswati Mohan about, the content distribution and, the content consumption patterns, the way we see unfolding over the next few months. Who wants to go at that? Feel free to come in, anyone who wants to take that question. Okay, so Margaret, can I put you on the spot?
So can you repeat the question? Sorry, that was the reason why I was delayed.
From Saraswati Mohan. She asks, how will content distribution and consumption change in the coming days?
Well, I think it's in terms of what I'm seeing our clients share in terms of content is this notion about being authentic and understanding your audiences, is also taking a different position on what you're promoting on channels. It's being mindful that right now, nobody wants to sell. What they want to see is what you're doing to respond to the pandemic. A great example is a client disclaimer of ours is McDonald's. And, as much as we love our McDonald's, they're typically their positioning is about sales and promotion. But if you see anything that they have distributed on their channels is about safety, for instance. So the latest is last week was safety on, how often, in terms of an infographic, how often they're disinfecting their restaurants in certain markets. If you go to a store, I know that Singapore just opened back, I believe. But if you go to a store, it's about, you see an employee with a sticker on their chest that shows their body temperature, so that both the customer as well as the employee, there's a real focus on, kind of this notion of safety and cleanliness, which I think is the important push on content for all companies.
Tarun, you want to come in on that quickly? And then I have a question for Doug.
Yeah, I think, look, we can again, talk about, the platforms and the channels and stuff like that. But I think just in terms of, overarching, kind of trends here, I'd say that, look, no matter what industry you're in right now, a lot of your communications basically is happening through, that whole COVID-19 prism, right? So if I'm an airline company, it's basically through the COVID-19 prism, when is it going to be business as usual? What is business as usual going to look like? If I'm a cruise ship industry, or, what if we got hit with another, surge of cases? I mean, would you have 5,000 people, kind of drifting endlessly? So this whole thing about, that COVID-19 lens, is here to stay, for the foreseeable future. And I think, the second thing is, we also have to take into account, the receptivity, so for example, in our traditional industry, our journalists, right, we couldn't necessarily pitch them something that didn't make sense to them. And I think in this environment, I think we've got to be very careful of being seen as tone deaf, right? So, the media or, any other platforms that you're engaging to basically push your content through, if it's earned first in some shape or form, it can't be tone deaf, because, people will be like, what are you talking about?
Yes. So Doug, this one is right up your alley. Shreya has a question about, trust in government being essential to success under a pandemic. And what does a government, do to kind of earn that trust and go on with it? Because this is going to be a long haul and people will lose their calm, people will have all kinds of questions. So suddenly governments need to communicate, need the understanding way more than before.
Yeah, well, I think obviously a key thing for governments is to be able to communicate competence in addressing the pressing challenges of different phases of COVID-19, and also communicate that they are applying the appropriate hierarchy of concern. Health and safety first, economics also very important, but getting that balance appropriate and correct at different phases of the situation. Also, relying on the experts, not having government contradict itself all over the place, not undermining the science, or not having, letting spokespeople get out there who send the wrong messages, or messages that create fear and uncertainty rather than reassure. Obviously, government needs to be able to communicate that there is uncertainty and to manage that uncertainty in a sensible way. And we've seen in different markets in the region where the standing of government hasn't ever been higher in the last few years, because they've seemed to have done a great job. That's not the situation everywhere, but some governments are really being seen to be really competent and doing a really good job applying the right principles, calling on the right experts, doing the right things. And part of that too is listening and engaging with the publics and the stakeholders, so that they're adapting as they go, so they're refining as they go.
Absolutely, they're stepping up to the challenge, but obviously a lot of professional help could go their way as well. Just as an anecdote, some of the government notifications, when you read, it's just hard to decipher from a layman's perspective. So I guess there is an intervention in order.
And one other point on government, another aspect of what we're doing with government is helping them navigate the geopolitical consequences of COVID-19. So not just how do they manage their internal response, but also the international relations dimension, geopolitical dimension. There's all sorts of possible developments in that regard. In the race to vaccines, what if we don't end up with a vaccine? What if we do? And then certain countries require priority access to those therapies or vaccines. Who's going to be getting it? Who's left out? How are international relations and relationships going to be a factor in that? What's the right thing to do? All of that are very complex and complicated for national governments to be addressing.
Okay, one more question, Naseem Sood, this one coming your way, ST. Interesting. So the question is, what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge faced by the public relation firms post-COVID scenario? You could give an example in context of your country, or what are you doing to address it? Would you want to take that?
Sure, absolutely. From a communications perspective, I think the challenge is to continue to make sure that you are communicating in a way that, don't go back to the old habits, I guess is the way that I will say it. Continue to engage with audiences, continue to tell them what's happening inside your environment, continue to drive that trust and value and values, and really understand, what is the needs of those audiences and how to engage with them and be where they want to be, give them what they want, what they want to hear from you, and give it to them in the format that they want to consume the information. I think those are going to be some of the things that we have to continue to have consistency around. I think that, we right now, I call this year the year of sort of reimagination and reinvention, right? Because, everybody's looking for new ways to communicate, to engage in those things. But with the fundamental thing that's not going to change is personalization, and really continuing to make sure that however you do it, if you are creating virtual experiences for your brands and to engage with your consumers, it's not just about putting something live streaming, but it's really about personalizing it. If you are trying to make sure that people understand that you really cared about your employees, it's not about just telling them, it's about showing them how you cared about that. So personalization to me continues to be something that will thread throughout everything that we do. And it's going to be a continued challenge that we face every day. And the good news for all of us here on the panel is that, with the advent of social media and digital that, we've been talking about, is that we have become agile marketers. And, because everything is real time, it's no longer about, 6 months planning and so forth. And I think we just need to continue that. That will continue to, I think it's going to accelerate. And so to me, it's not so much about a challenge, but the opportunity to continue to drive those things and help our clients keep their eyes on those things that are going to matter.
Absolutely. So personalization, and Margaret, to your point, you talked about, and everyone else, about trust. So build credible, trusted relationships, hyper-personalize it, and leverage the virtual channels as much as we can. You wanted to come in, Margaret, in terms of any challenge that you want to identify and what can we do as a community to address it better?
Well, I'll speak more from the agency side rather than say the discipline of public relations. I think, we all see our clients really having to manage a lot when it comes to profitability. I think it will be very important for us as agencies to consider our model on how we're being, partners during this time rather than being transactional. I think is really important. I think also measurement is going to be very key because there's going to be greater scrutiny at the end of the day on what we're all doing. So as much as we talk about creativity, I think that really it will be a greater push on the kind of the art and the science of what we do as communicators, and particularly on the agency side. So again, I think that's going to be for all of us a kind of a new pressure coming post-COVID or after the pandemic kind of we settle.
Sure. So we are kind of, tailing our time, another 10 minutes to go. So what I'm going to do is throw a question at each one of you. Each one will have to answer, but make it short and simple. So the first one is, if there is a brand playbook, what will be the 3 key words? And if you have to just sort of, highlight by only 3 key words, or maybe 1, or maybe a line, what will that be? The quintessentials of a brand playbook in a post-COVID world. Tarun?
Well, I mean, you said 3 words. I'd probably give you 2. Be authentic. And I think, that is probably going to be a massive, massive pillar for any company to build its proposition around.
Yes, that's good. Be authentic. Margaret?
Transparent. I think Etsy was mentioning it before, is I think at the end, nothing is going to be reinvented. I think what we have always held true in everything that we do core is always told clients to be authentic. We also tell them to be transparent. I think that's very important.
Transparent. Doug, what are your keywords?
Purpose-driven and data-driven.
Purpose-driven and data-driven. That's interesting. Esti?
Continue to live by your values. I still think the words are trust, value, and values. That's going to continue to be very important.
Absolutely. So trust, values, transparency, be authentic, and data. I believe in data as much. I think it keeps us honest. It's the mirror that we all look to every day. So that's fantastic. So let me ask you this then. What's in and what's out? One thing you think is just, met its end, and another thing that you think will be there with vengeance, or, will be the most relevant. Margaret?
Less sell, more show. It's not the aggressive marketing push any longer. Particularly now, it's really about your actions speaking louder than your words.
Absolutely. Less is more. Tarun?
Well, there is a cliche, right? And I, again, push this out from a view, or from the point of view of what we do, which is communication. So, there's this cliche, business as usual, and I change that a little bit. I'd say business as unusual.
Business as unusual. That's an interesting one. Doug, you got one?
Enhance public affairs and government affairs capabilities, given the expanded role of government in all of this and the fact that that's going to endure for quite some time. And attitudes to government vis-a-vis business have been significantly impacted by this situation.
I think that's one to stay. Esti?
Yes, putting the audience at the core, right in the middle, and really, understanding their need, putting their needs first, people's needs first.
Absolutely. Such a basic, isn't it, as communicators? What's in it for the audience matters more than what we want to push. So pull versus push, very interesting. And if I have to ask you about your winning strategy through this, what will that be? Let me bring in Doug this time round.
Combining top-down and bottom-up public affairs approaches. So engaging those core hierarchies in government, but also engaging the networks that influence those hierarchies through technology.
A 360-degree approach. That means a lot of work for us, of course, as a community.
Yeah.
Margaret?
I think understanding your audience, understanding what they're wanting to hear from you and how to engage. And that could be government, that could be regulators, that could be consumers. But I think it's fundamentally understanding what it is your audience wants and needs.
Tarun, you want to give it a shot?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think generally, I think no matter what we do or what we say, I think I alluded to this before, it can't really be tone deaf. So, whether, it's a government, it's a corporation, whatever kind of entity it is, whatever we say for it to really resonate, it can't be tone deaf, sorry.
All right, Esti, your winning strategy.
Yes, I think I'll continue with my theme, which is continue to understand the evolving mindset and really be authentic in how you connect with and engage with them. That would be the winning strategy for any brand.
Fantastic. If I can now request the team to show up what the poll results look like. And, just the fact that we have such a diverse panel here, right? We have China, we have Korea, we have India, we have New York, everyone. So this is interesting. Oh my God. So 98% of our audience think technology adoption by PR firms will increase significantly in a post-COVID world. That's an interesting takeaway for us, right? For those of us listening, we said, audience, what's in it for audience matters. So that's the audience speaking up. Let's get going with more technology adoption as we go through. So thank you so much for joining us on this panel. It was lovely meeting you all and seeing you all, and great, honest conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tuhina, for guiding this insightful conversation. And thanks to all the panelists for taking the time out for this chat. Thanks to all the attendees as well who joined us on Zoom and on YouTube. Apologies if we couldn't take your questions. This webinar will be available on our YouTube channel by tomorrow. So if you want to watch it again or share it with anyone who missed it, you can find it on our YouTube channel. We host these conversations every Wednesday evening. And our next conversation is our final edition of this series. It's an international panel discussing employee well-being and how organizations can create environments more conducive for their employees. You'll find more details about this on our Twitter page, so do sign up for this. Once again, thanks for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, and we hope to see you all next week. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.